This is a suicide mission. Admiral Thompson's voice echoed through the Pentagon conference room as he stared at the operational plan presented by 42-year-old Navy Strategic Planning Specialist Captain Alexis Blackwood. A room full of seasoned officers shook their heads. The female officer's proposal was too risky, too radical, too impossible. But 72 hours later, Alexis's suicide plan would completely annihilate the enemy fleet and secure the greatest naval victory of the century. Tell us about a time you stood alone, because the story I'm about to tell you shows how one woman's courage can literally change the course of history. Captain Alexis Blackwood had spent 15 years proving herself in a world that constantly questioned her presence. At 42, she was recognized as Norfolk Naval Base's sharpest strategic analyst. But recognition and respect were two very different things in the Navy's Old Boys Club. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Pentagon's Strategic Planning Center as Alexis walked through corridors lined with portraits of naval heroes. All men, all from different eras, all celebrated for victories she studied in minute detail. Her footsteps echoed on the polished marble floors, each step a reminder that she was walking where few women had walked before. Her service record was impeccable. Graduated top of her class from the Naval War College, served 3 deployments in the Persian Gulf, authored 12 strategic analysis papers that became required reading at Annapolis. Yet, every briefing room she entered carried the same unspoken question: what's she doing here? This particular morning was different. The summons to the Pentagon's inner strategic circle meant one thing: a crisis requiring immediate attention. As she entered Conference Room Alpha, the gravity of the situation became clear. Satellite images covered every available surface, showing enemy fleet positions that hadn't been seen since World War II. Admiral Thompson, a 30-year veteran with silver hair and scars from the Falklands, barely looked up as she took her seat. Around the table sat the Navy's elite: Admiral Foster, whose submarine campaign in the North Atlantic was legendary; Colonel Morrison, architect of the last successful amphibious assault; Commander Hayes, the youngest admiral in Navy history; and 6 other officers whose combined experience spanned decades of naval warfare. Alexis was the only woman. She was also, at 42, among the youngest in the room. And she was about to challenge everything they believed about naval strategy. The briefing began with grim efficiency. Intelligence Officer Commander Walsh outlined the situation. An enemy fleet of unprecedented size had positioned itself across the Strait of Hormuz, effectively controlling one of the world's most critical shipping lanes. Commercial vessels were being targeted systematically. International pressure was mounting for immediate action. "Gentlemen," Admiral Thompson's voice carried the weight of command. "Traditional assault tactics project a 60% casualty rate. That's unacceptable by any standard." The room fell silent. 60% meant losing more than half their fleet, thousands of sailors, billions in equipment, and potentially the Navy's reputation for decades. "We need innovative approaches," Thompson continued, his eyes scanning the room before settling briefly on Alexis. "Any suggestions?" The first to speak was Admiral Foster. "Direct engagement with overwhelming force. Hit them hard and fast before they can coordinate a response." "That's the 60% scenario," Morrison interjected. "We need to consider submarine warfare. Cut off their supply lines first." "Their sonar technology is too advanced," Hayes countered. "We'd lose our submarine advantage within hours." As the debate continued, Alexis studied the satellite images with different eyes. While her colleagues saw defensive positions and firepower distributions, she saw patterns, gaps in coverage, timing discrepancies in patrol routes, logistical vulnerabilities that experience might overlook. 20 minutes into the discussion, she raised her hand. "Sir, I have an alternative approach." The conversation stopped. Admiral Thompson's eyebrows rose slightly. "We're listening, Captain." Alexis stood, moved to the digital display, and highlighted a section of the strait that made several officers visibly uncomfortable. "Current strategy focuses on confronting the enemy at their strongest point," she began, her laser pointer tracing the main fleet position. "But here," she indicated a seemingly impregnable section, "there's an opening they don't expect." "That sector is mined," Colonel Morrison interrupted immediately. It's been a no-go zone for months. Not anymore, sir. Alexis's voice remained steady. Latest intelligence indicates the minefield has shifted. Last week's typhoon displaced the defensive line by approximately 800 meters, but enemy command hasn't updated their positions because they're operating on old charts. The room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Admiral Foster leaned forward. Captain, you're suggesting we stake the entire operation on weather data? Not weather data, sir. Sonar analysis, satellite imagery, and 3 independent intelligence sources confirm the shift. The enemy believes that sector is impassable, so they've left it virtually undefended. Admiral Thompson's expression darkened. Captain Blackwood, this is highly speculative. If you're wrong about those minefields. I'm not wrong, sir. Alexis's confidence was absolute. I've verified the data through multiple channels. The passage is clear. Multiple channels can be compromised, Admiral Hayes pointed out. Enemy disinformation is sophisticated, which is precisely why I cross-referenced our intelligence with commercial shipping data, weather services, and underwater geological surveys, Alexis replied. The evidence is overwhelming. Have you ever been in a room where everyone thinks you're wrong, but you know, absolutely know, that you're right? That's exactly how Alexis felt as she watched the skeptical faces around the table. Not anymore, sir. Alexis's voice remained steady. Latest intelligence indicates the minefield has shifted. Last week's typhoon displaced the defensive line by approximately 800 meters. But enemy command hasn't updated their positions because they're operating on old charts. The room erupted in skeptical murmurs. Admiral Foster leaned forward. Captain, you're suggesting we stake the entire operation on weather data? Not weather data, sir. Sonar analysis, satellite imagery, and 3 independent intelligence sources confirm the shift. The enemy believes that sector is impassable, so they have left it virtually undefended. Admiral Thompson's expression darkened. Captain Blackwood, this is highly speculative. If you're wrong about those minefields... I'm not wrong, sir. Alexis's confidence was absolute. I've verified the data through multiple channels. The passage is clear. Multiple channels can be compromised, Admiral Hayes pointed out. Enemy disinformation is sophisticated, which is precisely why I cross-referenced our intelligence with commercial shipping data, weather services, and underwater geological surveys. Alexis replied. The evidence is overwhelming. Have you ever been in a room where everyone thinks you're wrong, but you know, absolutely know, that you're right? That's exactly how Alexis felt as she watched the skeptical faces around the table. The conference room door opened suddenly. Fleet Admiral Richardson, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, entered with the measured stride of absolute authority. Every officer in the room snapped to attention. As you were, Richardson commanded, his steel-gray eyes scanning the room. I'm here for a situation update. What's our operational plan? Admiral Thompson stepped forward. Sir, we've prepared a conventional frontal assault strategy. Risks are minimized through... What's the casualty projection? Richardson's question cut through the explanation like a blade. Thompson hesitated. Sir, we estimate 55 to 60% losses, but with proper execution, unacceptable. Richardson's judgment was immediate and final. Alternative options? Silence filled the room. Then Alexis stepped forward. Sir, I have an alternative proposal. Richardson turned his full attention to her. The first time in the meeting anyone had truly listened, rather than simply waited their turn to object. Proceed, Captain. Alexis outlined her strategy with clinical precision. The unmined corridor, flanking maneuver, positioning advantage, historical precedent. Richardson listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. Projected casualties. Sir, worst case scenario, 15% losses. Best case, minimal casualties with complete enemy surrender. This strategy has been tested? No, sir, but all supporting data has been independently verified through multiple intelligence channels. Richardson's next question silenced the room. Captain Blackwood, if this operation fails due to strategic miscalculation, you understand that 3,000 sailors' lives rest on your assessment. Do you accept that responsibility? The weight of the moment pressed down on everyone present. This wasn't just about naval strategy anymore. It was about leadership, courage, and the willingness to stake everything on conviction. Alexis looked directly into Richardson's eyes. Yes, sir. I accept full responsibility. Gentlemen, Richardson addressed the room. Objections to Captain Blackwood's strategy. Admiral Thompson spoke first. Sir, the plan relies heavily on intelligence that could be compromised. The intelligence has been triple verified, Alexis responded immediately. Admiral Foster raised his hand. Sir, this approach contradicts established naval doctrine. Established doctrine that projects 60% casualties, Richardson noted dryly. Commander Hayes tried once more. Sir, Captain Blackwood lacks the operational experience for command-level decision-making. This was the moment Alexis had been waiting for. Sir, if I may address that concern. Richardson nodded. My operational experience includes strategic analysis for Operation Desert Storm, intelligence coordination during the Iranian crisis, and tactical planning for 3 successful submarine deployments. While I haven't commanded a fleet in battle, I've studied every major naval engagement of the past century. Sometimes fresh perspective is exactly what old problems require. Richardson considered this for a long moment. Admiral Thompson, your recommendation. Thompson looked around the room, seeing the same skeptical faces that had greeted Alexis's proposal. But he also saw something else. The mathematical reality that conventional approaches meant losing half their fleet. Sir, he said slowly, I recommend we authorize Captain Blackwood's strategy. 72 hours later, the world witnessed one of the most decisive naval victories in modern history. Operation Silent Thunder launched at 0400 hours under cover of the continuing storm front. Alexis had been assigned as strategic coordinator aboard the flagship USS Reagan, working directly with Admiral Thompson, who had insisted on leading the operation personally. All units report ready, came the voice from the communications center. Alexis stood beside the battle management console, watching as 12 warships moved through the coordinates she had calculated. The unmined corridor appeared exactly as her analysis had predicted. Clear passage where enemy charts showed impassable danger. Contact bearing 180 degrees, the sonar operator announced. Enemy patrol, range 3,000 meters. This was the first test. If enemy forces detected the fleet moving through the supposedly mined sector, the entire operation would collapse. Silent running, Admiral Thompson ordered. All units maintain position. For 37 minutes, the American fleet ghosted through waters the enemy believed were impassable. Alexis watched the sonar displays, tracking both friendly and hostile signatures, calculating timing down to the second. Enemy patrol moving off, sonar reported. Clear to proceed. By 0800 hours, the fleet had achieved the impossible, complete positioning behind enemy lines without detection. Admiral Thompson turned to Alexis with an expression that mixed amazement with respect. Captain, your analysis was perfect. We're in position. Thank you, sir. Recommend we hold this position until enemy response to our decoy fleet confirms they're committed to frontal defense. The decoy operation was Alexis's secondary innovation, a smaller force, making obvious preparations for traditional assault, drawing enemy attention while the main fleet moved into position. At 0830, enemy communications confirmed they had taken the bait. All enemy vessels moving to forward positions, intelligence reported. They're preparing for frontal engagement. Perfect, Admiral Thompson smiled grimly. Captain Blackwood, you have tactical command for the engagement phase. The words hung in the air. A captain commanding admirals was unprecedented, but Richardson had personally authorized it. Alexis was about to direct the largest naval engagement in decades. All units, her voice carried across the battle network, prepare for synchronized engagement. Target priority, command vessels first, then systematic destruction of formation coherence. At 0845, 12 American warships opened fire simultaneously from a position no enemy strategist had thought possible. The psychological impact was as devastating as the physical damage. Enemy command vessel hit, came the first report. Secondary command vessel destroyed, followed immediately. Within minutes, the enemy fleet was in chaos. Without central coordination, superior numbers became a disadvantage. Ships collided while trying to turn, weapons fired into friendly vessels, communication systems overloaded with confused orders. The engagement lasted 47 minutes. When the smoke cleared, the enemy fleet had either surrendered or been destroyed. American casualties, 0 deaths, 3 minor injuries from equipment malfunctions. The post-operation briefing took place in the same Pentagon conference room where Alexis had been dismissed as reckless 72 hours earlier. But the atmosphere was completely different. Admiral Thompson stood as she entered. "Captain Blackwood," his voice carried genuine respect now, "I owe you an apology. When you presented this strategy, I let preconceptions cloud my judgment." Around the table, the same officers who had questioned her competence now stood in acknowledgement. Admiral Foster stepped forward. "Captain, your strategic analysis was brilliant. I've never seen anything like it." Commander Hayes, who had been most vocal in his skepticism, approached last. "Captain, I was wrong about your experience, about your judgment, about everything. That operation will be studied at war colleges for decades. But the most significant change wasn't in their words. It was in how they addressed her. No longer the female officer or Captain Blackwood, the woman in strategic planning. She was simply Captain Blackwood, naval strategist. Fleet Admiral Richardson requested a private meeting. "Captain, your performance has earned you a position as Director of Strategic Innovation, the youngest officer ever to hold that position. The Navy needs people who can think beyond conventional wisdom." "Thank you, sir. I accept, with one condition." Richardson raised an eyebrow. "Which is, future strategic planning includes diverse perspectives from the beginning, not as an afterthought. The best ideas can come from anywhere, and rank or experience shouldn't automatically determine whose voice gets heard." "Agreed," Richardson nodded. "In fact, I'm making that Navy policy. Every strategic planning session will include officers from different backgrounds, experience levels, and specialties." The changes went beyond personal recognition. Alexis's strategy became the foundation for a new approach to naval warfare, one that emphasized intelligence analysis, unconventional thinking, and adaptability over traditional force projection. 6 months later, she was invited to address the Naval War College, where her lecture on innovation and strategic thinking became mandatory curriculum for all naval officers. What happened in that Pentagon conference room wasn't just about military strategy. It was about the courage to challenge established thinking when lives are at stake. The operation Alexis planned didn't just win a battle, it prevented a war. Intelligence later revealed that enemy forces had been preparing for a larger conflict, believing American naval capabilities were predictable and limited. The decisive defeat forced a complete strategic reassessment and ultimately led to peace negotiations. But perhaps the most important victory was the precedent it set. The Navy's new policy of inclusive strategic planning led to innovations that would have been impossible under the old system. Junior officers began contributing ideas that senior leadership incorporated into operational doctrine. 3 months after the operation, something unprecedented happened at the Naval War College. For the first time in its 140-year history, a strategic innovation course was taught by someone who had actually revolutionized naval warfare in real time. Captain Blackwood's first lecture drew an audience that included not just naval officers, but representatives from the Air Force, Army, and even international military observers. The auditorium that normally held 200 was packed with over 400 attendees, with many standing along the walls. "Strategy," she began, looking out at the sea of uniforms, "isn't about having the right answer. It's about asking the right questions." She clicked to her first slide, the original Pentagon meeting room. 72 hours before our victory, I was the least experienced person in this room. But experience isn't just about time served. It's about how you use that time to see patterns others miss. In the audience, Admiral Thompson sat in the front row, taking notes like a first-year cadet. The man who had initially called her strategy suicide was now her most vocal advocate, having requested transfer to her new Strategic Innovation Division. But the real transformation was happening beyond the military. News of the operation had leaked to the press, and while operational details remained classified, The story of a female officer revolutionizing naval strategy became international news. CNN ran a segment titled "The Captain Who Changed Warfare." The BBC featured her story as part of their Women Who Shape History series. Even the New York Times published an editorial calling for more inclusive leadership in all industries, not just the military. The response wasn't entirely positive. Some retired officers criticized the Navy for political correctness, arguing that the operation's success was luck rather than skill. But these voices were increasingly drowned out by results. 6 months after the operation, 3 more female officers were promoted to strategic planning positions. A year later, the Navy's Strategic Innovation Division, now led by the newly promoted Admiral Blackwood, had developed 12 new tactical approaches that were being adopted by allied navies worldwide. Have you ever noticed how one person's courage can create permission for others to be brave? That's exactly what happened after Alexis's breakthrough. Young officers who had remained silent in meetings began speaking up. Experienced personnel started questioning long-held assumptions. Most importantly, the culture of "that's how we've always done it" began giving way to "how can we do it better?" Lieutenant Commander Stevens, a logistics specialist who had served quietly for 8 years, developed a revolutionary supply chain strategy that reduced operational costs by 30%. When asked what inspired him to propose such radical changes, he said simply, "Captain Blackwood showed us that being different isn't dangerous, staying the same is. But transformation isn't without its challenges." Despite her success, Alexis faced subtle resistance from some quarters. Certain officers questioned whether her promotion was truly merit-based. Some suggested her strategy had been lucky rather than brilliant. The whispers hurt more than the direct confrontation had. At least when Admiral Thompson called her planned suicide, he was honest about his skepticism. The quiet undermining was harder to address, harder to prove, harder to fight. 3 months after her promotion, Alexis found herself alone in her office late one evening, reviewing casualty reports from previous operations, the ones that had followed conventional wisdom and cost hundreds of lives. The weight of those numbers and the knowledge that her luck had prevented similar losses sustained her through the difficult moments. That night, she received an encrypted message that changed everything. It was from the enemy commander who had surrendered during the operation. "Captain Blackwood," it read, "your strategy was the most innovative naval maneuver I've encountered in 25 years of service. You didn't just defeat us, you taught us that warfare itself is evolving. We have formally adopted your flanking principles in our own naval doctrine. Respectfully, Admiral Chen." The irony wasn't lost on her. While some of her own colleagues questioned her methods, the enemy commander recognized their brilliance immediately. A year after the operation, Alexis received a letter from a young Naval Academy cadet. "Captain Blackwood, your example showed me that being different isn't a disadvantage. It's exactly what the Navy needs. Thank you for proving that courage comes in many forms." The letter was signed by Midshipman Patricia Walsh, the first woman to graduate #1 in her class at Annapolis in over a decade. What the media coverage didn't show was the 18-hour days Alexis spent in the months following the operation, defending every detail of her strategy to multiple congressional committees. The success had made her famous, but fame in military circles comes with intense scrutiny. "Captain Blackwood," Senator Martinez had asked during one particularly challenging hearing, "some critics suggest your strategy was reckless gambling that happened to pay off. How do you respond?" Alexis had looked directly at the camera, knowing her answer would be broadcast worldwide. "Senator, with respect, the reckless gamble was continuing to use strategies that we knew would cost 60% casualties. Innovation isn't gambling when it's based on solid intelligence and historical precedent." The hearing room had fallen silent. Behind her, Admiral Thompson had nodded almost imperceptibly, a gesture of support that meant more than any medal. But the questioning continued for 3 days. Every decision, every piece of intelligence, every calculated risk was dissected by politicians who had never faced enemy fire but felt qualified to judge those who had. The pressure was immense. Alexis found herself waking at 3 a.m., running through scenarios, double-checking calculations she had verified dozens of times. The weight of proving that her success wasn't luck, that women in military leadership could be trusted with the highest stakes, pressed down on her shoulders every single day. During this period, she received an unexpected visitor. Admiral Richardson appeared at her office door one evening, carrying 2 cups of coffee. "Mind if I sit down, Admiral?" he asked, using her new rank. "Of course, sir. You know," Richardson said, settling into the chair across from her desk, "I've been in this business for 37 years. I've seen strategies succeed and fail, leaders rise and fall. But I've never seen anyone face the level of scrutiny you're enduring." Alexis looked up from the report she'd been reviewing. "Sir, it comes with the territory." "No," Richardson shook his head. "It doesn't. Male officers who achieve similar breakthroughs don't face congressional hearings. They get medals and book deals. You get investigated." The honesty was refreshing. For months, Alexis had felt like she was imagining the extra scrutiny, the additional burden of proof required for her achievements. "But here's what they don't understand," Richardson continued. "Your strategy didn't just win a battle, it prevented World War III. Intelligence estimates suggest that enemy force was preparing for a multi-theater conflict. Your decisive victory convinced them that conventional warfare against U.S. forces was futile. They chose negotiation over escalation." He pulled out a classified folder. "These are the peace treaty drafts, signed 3 days ago. The war that almost started has been permanently prevented." 6 months later, something remarkable happened. Admiral Thompson, the man who had initially called her strategy suicide, requested a private meeting. "Admiral Blackwood," he began formally, then stopped. "Actually, may I call you Alexis?" She nodded, curious about this change in tone. "Alexis, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you an explanation." Thompson sat heavily in his chair, suddenly looking older than his 62 years. "When you presented that strategy, I didn't just disagree with it. I was threatened by it." This confession surprised her. Thompson had always projected absolute confidence. "You see," he continued, "for 30 years, I'd built my reputation on being the Navy's strategic mind. I'd authored doctrine, trained officers, led successful operations. And then you walked into that room with an approach I never would have considered, backed by analysis more thorough than anything I'd ever done." He paused, staring out the window at the ships in the harbor. "My first instinct wasn't to evaluate your strategy. It was to protect my ego. I called it suicide because accepting its brilliance meant admitting I'd been thinking too narrowly for decades." Alexis remained silent, understanding that this conversation had taken considerable courage. "But watching you execute that plan, seeing the results, observing how you handled the aftermath, it changed everything for me. You didn't just innovate tactically, you demonstrated a kind of leadership I'd never encountered." Thompson looked directly at her. "I want to serve under your command in the Strategic Innovation Division, not as a favor, not as political theater, but because I believe I can learn things from you that I should have learned years ago." The request was unprecedented. A senior admiral asking to serve under a junior officer's command simply didn't happen in the Navy's traditional hierarchy. "Admiral Thompson," Alexis replied carefully, "I'd be honored to have your experience on the team, but I need to know. Can you handle taking direction from someone who, 6 months ago, you thought was dangerously inexperienced?" Thompson smiled, the first genuine smile she'd ever seen from him. "Alexis, the most dangerous thing in warfare isn't inexperience. It's the inability to recognize when you need to learn something new." 3 months later, their unlikely partnership would produce the Navy's most comprehensive strategic doctrine overhaul in 50 years. Thompson's experience combined with Alexis's innovation created approaches that neither could have developed alone. The transformation was remarkable to witness. In joint briefings, Thompson would defer to Alexis's analysis while she incorporated his operational insights. Their collaboration became a model for how military leadership could evolve, not through replacement of experience with innovation, but through their synthesis. Did you know that some of the most significant military innovations came from people who were initially dismissed by their peers? The development of radar, sonar technology, even aircraft carriers, All faced resistance from established military thinking before proving their worth. Alexis Blackwood's story reminds us that the most dangerous enemy of progress isn't external opposition. It's internal resistance to new ideas. This story isn't just about naval strategy or military history. It's about the courage to stand up for what you believe in, even when everyone else thinks you're wrong. Captain Alexis Blackwood didn't just save lives that day. She changed how an entire institution thinks about leadership and innovation. She proved that the best strategies often come from unexpected sources, and that experience without openness to new ideas becomes a limitation rather than an asset. Think about the women in your life who've had to fight twice as hard to get half the recognition. The colleagues who see solutions that others miss. The quiet voices in the room who might have the answer everyone's looking for. If this story resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear that their voice matters. Leave a comment telling us about a time when you had to stand up for an idea others dismissed. And remember, every time you choose courage over comfort, you're not just changing your own story, you're creating space for others to be brave too. Subscribe to Hidden Heroes Stories if you believe that the most important victories often happen in quiet rooms away from cameras and celebrations, because every silent hero deserves to have their story told. What city are you watching from? Let us know in the comments. We love connecting with our global family of people who understand that real strength doesn't always announce itself. Thank you for being part of our community. And remember, your story matters too.